My name is Dave Anderson, one of the reporters and one of the meteorologists at KBJR TV for 37 doggone years. And as I was just telling Owen there, you don't make much money in local media. You make about the same amount of money at my experience level as a guy working out in the yard at Menards. But it's still better than the other TV stations in town. Channel 10, talking with one of their reporters recently, he was hoping his next contract they would bump him up to $16 an hour. And talking to the Fox 21 folks like Owen back there, they look longingly at the sign at McDonald's that promises $18 an hour and wishes they were working there. So there's not much money in it. You got to do it for the love. And I do it, well, again, because I'm a quarter Finn from the Martillas here in Tower, don't you know? Stubborn Finlander, you're going to give me low pay the rest of my life. I'll show you, I'll take it. So I started at Channel 6 in 1987, 6 weeks after graduating from UMD. I had been working at Channel 3 as the janitor for at least the previous year. I wanted to really get my foot in the door and watch Marsh Nelson work behind the scenes before I moved up to something like working a camera. And so when I graduated from college, I did indeed apply to work up to the camera from being a janitor. And the guy in charge of hiring just let out a big yawn. I didn't hear a peep. So that's why I got the second job at Channel 6. And for a couple years afterwards, I would put on the news at Channel 6 and then at 10:30 go over to Channel 3 and clean the building. That's that Finlander Sisu for you, isn't it? And over the years, I've worked up from janitor to cameraman to reporter to meteorologist. But on the side, I learned a passion about this thing called the Coast Guard Auxiliary. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. I got to chat a little bit more about my Tower-Soudan roots. It's always fun to be here in the Herb Lampa Civic Center because he's such a legend too, isn't he? Did a lot for this town. My roots in this town go back a long ways, and Nancy may have to be my technical director here if I can't make this thing work right. My roots in this town go back probably to the 1890s with my great-grandfather, Harry Anderson. Some of you may have remembered him. He variably from the 20s on up was either town constable, deputy sheriff, maintenance worker, or unemployed, depending on city government. When your ally was in charge, you got the job back, and when someone else got elected, you got laid off. And so Harry and his wife Signe lived that lifestyle for a long time. I'm the grandson of their son, Pella Anderson, from over there on North 2nd Street. He did the unspeakable in 1940, as I've mentioned before. The Swedish Anderson married a Finlander. Not Martha, my great aunt, Ellen Martilla, Martha's twin sister, my grandmother. And so then I'm the son of Terry Anderson, class of 1961, who unfortunately passed away back in January. He was always too shy to come to things like this, but he sure loved watching them on cable access TV. So I'm glad Owen is back there videotaping this one here tonight. Now, I heard some rumors here that bubbled up. I've only heard a couple of these rumors over the many years that my father was the one who lit the bonfire on fire the day before homecoming back in the 50s. Dave Desnoy Jr. is the one who reminded us of that this morning. I can't say if that's true or not, but also Dave Desnoy Sr. once told me that he had done that. Dad never admitted to it, but there's two now saying that he did do it. So if you've ever wondered about that mystery, there's strong evidence that my father was the rebel that set that on fire. And of course, then my other great-grandfather was Const Martilla, and my grandmother, Ellen. And they're all gone now, but geez, it's weird to be the patriarch in the family now. I'm hoping I follow after my great-grandmother Signe, who lived to be 96, and my grandmother Ellen, who lived to be 97, and go that route rather than the men in the family who run it just a little bit shorter. We'll see what's going on here these days. All right, so my roots in this town go a long ways back. My grandfather Pella had a cabin on Breezy Point out there on Fraser Bay and Lake Vermilion. He bought it at around 1962. Someone here in town tried to sell it to him for $3,000. My grandfather didn't need a lake place. No, so the guy went down to $2,500. Even adjusted for inflation today, that's what, maybe 50 grand? Who's gonna get a lake place for $50,000 these days? And of course, when Grandpa passed on, my dad inherited the place. Now that he's passed on, my sister and I are splitting it. So we've got that little place that's been there all my life if I was born in 1964. I got a nice picture of my Aunt Jill Phillips, Jill Anderson, if you remember her, I think class of 76 here in Tower-Soudan. It must be 1965. There's little infant me sitting on one of the rocks and she's holding my head, twisting it towards the camera. You know, there's that kick to recreate pictures like that. 40, 50 years later, I tried to talk her to doing that. She won't have nothing to do with it. It's like I'm the only extrovert in the family. Everyone else is so shy, which is weird because my dad had to talk 6 hours a day to Ely school kids for 33 years, but to come here and do something like this, he never would have done it. So anyway, my roots go back way a long time on Lake Vermilion. That was the way to live. It still is. What a great place. And when I was about 8 to 10 years old, boy, did I get a hankering for one of those inflatable little rafts. And I envisioned paddling all over Lake Vermilion and that thing exploring the bays and the inlets. Well, reality comes around. You get a raft like that. You don't go that far. Around the point a little bit, off to the other point, but you know, you don't go from Fraser Bay over to Big Bay and battle the waves. But when I was blessed with that little raft, my father told me to watch out for the Coast Guard. He was worried that you had to register a little 3-foot dinghy that you blew up. And the Coast Guard was pretty picky back in the day, I've heard, back in the 60s, especially when they decided that Lake Vermilion was navigable, federally navigable water. And there were big regulations put in place. And you know, Tower Ely people don't put up kindly with regulations. Look at Sumner Purvis out there in Purvis country over by Eagle's Nest. I got to do a story on him one of these days as well. Speaking of my stories, Dave Desnoy Jr. didn't make it in today. No, doesn't. Oh, maybe that's him. Wouldn't this be the perfect introduction? And? No. All right. I got to do a story on Purvis someday. And Dave Desnoy Sr. got mentioned on the Holding On to History of this week as I did a history of snowmobiling. You remember, many of you might remember that Dave Desnoy had the first Arctic Cat in town, personally delivered from Thief River Falls in 1962. Well, now a collector in Cloquet owns that machine. You know, it went, when Dave died, they sold it to Terry Wagner, who sold it to the Fenskys at Ely, and now this guy named Wes Vork in Carleton Cloquet has it, and I saw it at a snowmobile show. It's like, that looks like the first Arctic Cat from Tower-Soudan, and it turns out it was, so I did a story on the history of snowmobiling featuring Desnoy's old cat. And I remember Dave telling me that in the mid-70s, Arctic Cat tried to buy that machine back from him. They were gonna trade him a brand new LT Gray for his 1962 D500, big red tank with an engine on the rear, side-by-side seating and a steering wheel. It was a cool machine. It used to sit out at Dave's bulldozer shack out there on Highway 1, at least back in the 90s. Anyway, he didn't take that deal. And talking to Mr. Vork, probably the reason Arctic Cat wanted to buy that machine back is his evidence shows that was the first Arctic Cat ever built. So there's Tower-Soudan's part in snowmobiling history, and you can find it online now at northernnewsnow.com. Click on the section Holding On to History. You can find all my tower-based stories in that. And there's been quite a few, because why do stories with strangers when you can hop into a town full of friends and find history at the drop of a hat? Now, finally getting into the history of the Coast Guard Auxiliary, and specifically Lake Vermilion's Flotilla 28-4. The Coast Guard Auxiliary, I first heard about those guys in the 90s, in that dead zone between Desert Storm and 9/11. When Desert Storm hit, of course, they told us, oh, Iraq has got the 4th greatest army in the world. We can't fight them. It'll be another Vietnam. It'll take forever. We'll be way down in quagmire. And, all the young men are going to be drafted. So, I'm working at Channel 6. We're going to be drafted. All right, when my notice comes, I'll go do my duty. And we know what happened in real life. In 30 days, Saddam Hussein was crushed, and everybody came home. and the government decided they didn't need such a big military. They were dropping people out of the military at the drop of a hat. One of my friends from Winton, who was in the Army Guard, they let him go. His wife was a Navy reservist. She dared to get pregnant. That was enough reason to let her go. And so, gee, you're not going to draft me. Well, I want to join something. What was available? Well, I discovered the Coast Guard Auxiliary through two of the members coming to Channel 6 to be interviewed. And I thought, well, that sounds like a pretty neat opportunity. You can serve right in your own backyard. And so I joined, and now I'm the old-timer in the Duluth Flotilla. That's hard to believe. Patriarch of my family, now the old-timer in the local unit. Where does time go? I still feel 20 in here. Do I look 60 now out here? Probably do, unfortunately. My wife is the one who still looks like she's 19. I guess growing up in the bogs of cotton really preserves your skin. Keeps your hair brown too. I've gone silvery gray and she's still a stunning brunette. Well, some guys get lucky once in a while, I guess. So the Coast Guard Auxiliary, I've joined that. I've been in it for more than 25 years now, and I'm honored to tell you guys all about it, because that Coast Guard that my dad told me to watch out for probably was the local Lake Vermilion flotilla that ran for a number of years. Now, let's see if I can make this thing advance. And we'll try to blow this up for you. And now it doesn't seem to want to do that. Well, hopefully you can read it. Magic, ah. The U.S. Coast Guard, of course, traces its roots back to the year 1790. Started as the Revenue Cutter Service. The government started that to protect our coasts and make sure, you know, just like today, people trying to sneak past the tariffs couldn't get into our country. Now it's drugs we watch out for. Back then it was rum runners and things like that. In the World War I era, the Revenue Cutter Service and the Lifehouse Service and the Rescue Service, all these little nautical branches got formed into one and called the Coast Guard. And of course, what happened 10 years later? The Great Depression hit. And the Coast Guard's always been the smallest branch of service and perhaps the oddest branch of service. It's not in the Department of Defense. Now it's in the Department of Homeland Security. After a long time in the Treasury Department and the Transportation Department, now the Department of Homeland Security. So it's not quite like the Department of Defense. It's multifaceted, multi-mission. There's a military wing, an active duty military wing, and reserve component that is comparable to the U.S. Navy and can be absorbed by the Navy in times of war, like World War II. But there's also a civil purpose to the Coast Guard, you know, to rescue people, to educate people, and to administrate. So there are civilian employees, and then there's a hybrid between the two, uniformed volunteers, the auxiliary. That's what we're all about. We're unarmed. We can't take part in direct military action, direct law enforcement, which is a fine line. Technically, if I had earned the Coxswain rating, I could drive the boat to bust the drug runners. But I can't arrest them. So if I was part of the boarding party to get off the boat and get on the bad guy's ship, I couldn't do the arresting, but I could be behind them. So it's a little bit funky like that. Our primary mission, though, is to educate boaters and keep people safe. The other is to back the Coast Guard up in every mission they need a fill-in for. We're like the temporary service for the Coast Guard. Me as a TV guy, I do a lot of public affairs stuff. The cutters go out for ice breaking. Well, I get to make a video of that and things like that. And there are others in the local unit down in Duluth that get on the cutter and go all over the world. Well, I guess going all over the world for the Duluth cutter means up to like Greenland. And they do the cooking. There's one old retired doctor who sits in the comm center, answers the phone and dispatches. Those are the kind of missions that we can do to help out the Coast Guard. Because the Great Depression, we got this small branch of service. It's still understaffed, and back in the Depression with no money, it was really understaffed. So Congress created the auxiliary in 1939 to provide a pool of trained volunteers to help out the Coast Guard when they were short somebody. We're 2 years older than the Civil Air Patrol, which is the Air Force Auxiliary. The auxiliary of the Coast Guard is also 2 years older than the Coast Guard Reserve. So we're kind of proud of that. We're a little bit older than the reservists who come around, hang out in Station Duluth every now and then to do their duties on the weekends. Well, 2 years into existence, World War II comes. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. That morning, Coast Guard auxiliary boats were on patrol around the Hawaiian Islands, backing up the Navy. And of course, that evening, when a shell-shocked nation worried a Japanese invasion would hit, they were on duty again for security. That's another one of the missions we can do, is do security patrols. And just like a police reserve unit, if we spot bad guys, we call in the good guys. We're not supposed to go stop them ourselves. Call in the other guys. But in World War II, because of the nature of that conflict, well, the auxiliary was armed. The little fleet of boats, the Splinter Fleet, one of its nicknames, the Hooligan Navy, another one of its nicknames. You guys know Jack Pine Bob Carey from Ely? Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was a Marine in World War II. He took part in 3 big amphibious invasions. And last time I interviewed him and he heard that I was a Coast Guard auxiliarist, oh yeah, you're in the Hooligan Navy. Because it was a ragtag, a disciplined ragtag bunch of people on small boats patrolling the coast looking for U-boats and reporting them in. And auxiliary members back then were given like a ricing submachine gun, not a good Tommy gun. The active duty guys out in the war needed that, but this cheap little ineffective submachine gun, you got one of those. You're given a depth charge. You see a U-boat, roll that off the deck and hope for the best. There are some rumors that one auxiliary boat did chase down a U-boat, but that's not really been verified. What we did do was rescue thousands of survivors from merchant ships of submarine attacks, especially in the Gulf of Mexico and the East Coast when the German U-boat scourge was really rolling in 1942-43. So that was the World War II duties of the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary. You know, after 9/11, there was talk about militarizing us once again, and steps were taken towards that. That's why I'm wearing, as best an old man can, this relatively high and tight uniform. I talked to Ron Hine, because he used to be a member of the Lake Vermilion Flotilla, and it sure sounds like they were a lot easier going back in the 60s when he was a member. But now, you know, the discipline is almost as tough as being an active duty member. Although you can see that the age limits are relaxed for an auxiliary member, the grooming standards are a little bit relaxed. I needed a haircut, I wanted to get one. For some reason, I think every kid in school going back to school had all the barbershops booked up the other day. Yeah. So I didn't get the haircut. And as you can see, I'm a little bit on the girthy side, like most Anderson men. You know, that's what keeps us warm at 30 below. So those standards are relaxed a little bit, but you still have to snap to and show military courtesy. There's no joking around, kidding around, and that kind of stuff. Now, World War II ends, and the auxiliary goes back to its main mission of promoting recreational boating safety, teaching kids how to wear life jackets, teaching boaters the rules of the roads, what the buoys mean, and all that sort of thing, inspecting vessels for safety. That is one of the things we still do. And even Ron Hine, he used to do that too on Lake Vermilion back in the 60s. And those vessel safety checks, as they're called now, are not binding by law. You know, we're not out to arrest you. If you find you've got the worst boat in the world, all we can do is give you a list of what you need to do to make it better. We're not going to give you a ticket or anything like that. Although there was one active duty person on a boarding crew at the Station Duluth wanted us to call into them when we found a really bad boat, and then they'd go bust them. But that blows the whole promise of non-legally binding and all that, and we refuse to do it, frankly. So if you get a VSC for your boat, it's a source of pride. When you pass, you put that sticker on your boat, and there you go. Allegedly, it helps when you're getting boarded. The Coast Guard will take it a little bit easier on you, but that all depends on how hard the coxswain of the boarding boat is, I guess. They've got discretion still. So we're getting into the 50s here now with this fresh volunteer unit called the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary. And in the 50s, it comes to Lake Vermilion, courtesy of Mrs. Wells, Leslie Griggs Wells. I heard a rumor that one of the Wells boys was going to come today. Are you here? Excellent. Which one are you?
Number 4, John.
Hi, John. I I used to interview your brother Mac all the time back in the day.
Sorry to hear that.
He was all right. I'm sorry to hear that he's passed. And of course, Sandy used to write a lot of cool interview articles for the Tower News in the history section there. So you Wells boys had a reputation of having a lot of fun, you know, with that air sled and all those kind of great things. I really enjoyed the story of diving the Lee mine pit, and then when the general manager of the Sudan mine caught wind of that, it was almost a federal case. What? Trespassing? Oh man. Thank you, sir. I'm glad that you're here. So you can verify all these things I say about your family.
Absolutely.
Because these are rumors I've heard since I was a little boy. Of course, Mrs. Wells is from the famous Griggs family out of Eveleth. Any UMD grads in the house here? I'm one. All right. You guys ever been to Griggs Hall?
Yeah.
Watch a football game at Griggs Field? That's the family she was from. She married into the Wells family, part of the Marshall Wells hardware empire, which was once the greatest hardware conglomerate in the world. So she wasn't a poor woman, but yes, John.
The Marshall Wells, the Wells is W-E-L-L-S.
True.
So
And you're Wells.
Father, your ES. Father happened to be a president, but he was not an owner or
Okay,
a beginner of Marshall Wells.
okay, but still a bigwig.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say president is a pretty important role. Thanks for clearing that up. I've always kind of wondered about that, Wells versus Wells. With Mrs. Wells, she could have been a pampered bonbon eating lady laying around in her moo-moo having servants do everything, but she was very active. Safety was her mantra. Wasn't she on Governor Freeman's board back in the 50s for safety in the state?
Green Cross on the safety board.
Very busy woman, very important woman, and the founder of the Coast Guard Auxiliary Flotillas in northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and a slice of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Today, the auxiliary consists of a flotilla in International Falls. I understand she chartered that one. And then Tower had Flotilla 28-4. Do you know what year that one was chartered? Okay, but that was her doing as well. I believe she also started the Bayfield Flotilla and one in Gogebic County perhaps, plus the one in Duluth. And we'll talk about the connection with Lake Vermilion and Duluth coming up here from what I've heard from the old timers in the auxiliary who have since passed as well. So Mrs. Wells gets the safety flotilla going here on Lake Vermilion. Now let's talk about some of the members who are in the local flotilla, and hopefully you guys can share memories with them. What was my inheritance from my grandmother? Well, cleaning out my father's garage last week up in the attic of the garage, I found her finished skis from the 30s. My grandmother and her twin sister Martha really loved outdoor winter activities. And I remember when my grandparents cleaned out their garage in the late 70s, they gave us those skis, and I actually used them through the early 80s. Big old long wooden Finlander skis strapped to my sorrels. You know, not of this modern binding stuff. And well, as I got older, we stopped using those, but they're still up in Dad's garage. They're going to be a nice display in my man cave here coming up, because they're a little worse for the wear. Dry storage didn't do them any favors, unfortunately. But along with that, I also got from Grandma her collection of Tower newspapers. She saved some important issues over the years. One was when Martillas got robbed. From like 1945. Const went out someplace and didn't lock his safe. Someone came in and stole his cash. And it was in some kind of money bag that he got from his father. So he didn't want the money back. He wanted the money bag back. I don't know if he ever got it or not. But Grandma saved that newspaper. And then she also saved the golden edition of the Tower News. That must have been from 1950. And then she also had from 1959 the Tower News covering Tower's Silver Jubilee. And in Tower Silver Jubilee edition, there's at least 2 stories about the Coast Guard Auxiliary. There was a big, as you can read, if you can read in this article here, Del Burgess and Bunker Hill were in charge of putting on boat races at McKinley Park. And the Coast Guard Auxiliary was roped in by those guys to provide the safety patrols for that event. Now, young Bunker Hill, I had to ask him, does this mean, was your dad part of the Coast Guard Auxiliary as well? And he says, no, he had never heard of that. So the original Bunker Hill was probably not, Dell probably wasn't either, but these other auxiliary members were there to help out. Oh, the missions that I've heard about that the auxiliary did back in those days. Number 1 was especially on Pike Bay, looking out for deadheads. Boy, I remember having to be the lookout for that in my dad's runabout or my grandfather's wooden Higgins boat. Boy, was that a beautiful craft, you know. You got the bow watch to stand, deadhead, starboard, you know, go to port. Do they still do that out there, or are those deadheads finally gone or sunk, or do they still bubble up every now and then? All right. That bottom is probably littered with them from back in the days of the sawmill, isn't it? That was one of the missions, types of things done in the Tower Flotilla back there in the day. Ron Hine, he would tell me about Mrs. Wells wearing a very beautiful blue uniform, but this is where the discipline must have been a little bit lax back in the 50s and 60s, because Ron, who was also in the Army National Guard at the time, but the neat thing is, with being in a DOD service and, well, back then probably a Treasury service, there's different overseers. You can be both. And we still have some guys like that that are both. We had an Army National Guardsman in our local unit in Duluth, and then when he'd wear this uniform for the Coast Guard, he had a combat infantryman badge on that he had earned over in Iraq. So there's a Coastie with a CIB. That's a dichotomy that you don't see that often. So let's talk about some of these members that were key from what I've read about in the Tower News. MJ Blazer, anybody know him? H.H. Stevens? John?
Matt Blazer was a game warden who lived in Virginia
Okay.
and did a lot of things up here on Lake Vermilion. Couple of the game wardens were very, very engaged in the lake safety.
Excellent. And they still are, actually. There's a DNR conservation officer who recently retired, who's the DNR's liaison to the Coast Guard family, and we did a lot of work with him. He's a really great guy. I think his dream for retiring was to ride a jet ski under the aerial lift bridge. I don't know if he accomplished that. I was supposed to put it on the news for him, but he never called me. Thank you for clearing that up, because I've studied all these names, and I have some information online that I was able to find out about them. And Mr. Blazer was not turning up anywhere. I was checking Tower sources, Cook sources. I should have been checking Virginia sources. That's what threw me off there. All right, H.H. Stevens, any memories? Yes, sir. Who are you?
Pearson.
Oh, okay, one of the famous Pearsons.
I'm not so sure about that.
Straight up from Costa Rica, I see.
Howard Stevens ran the local office of Minnesota Power here for many years and was involved with the Coast Guard Auxiliary. They had a home out on the south side of Pike Bay, and he sported a 17-foot Chris-Craft around the lake.
Interesting.
Nice guy.
Were either of you auxiliary members back in the day? Did your mom make you boys be members?
We had to go do inspections. We had 4th of July. We had the float. We had yeah. Thank you very much. It was fun. It was truly fun.
Mac once promised to show me all the pictures from your mom's photo album, but he passed on before we could get that. Hopefully those pictures still exist and get tossed out. If you ever come...
They exist in my house.
Well, if you ever want to share them with the flotilla, we'd be honored to keep your mom's memory alive, because I keep educating these young whippersnappers that join up all about the roots. And for filling me in on these names, of course, we all know John Dragavon, right? Yep, the bank president. Now it's Friends and Bank and Trust, Tower State Bank for a number of years. Boy, in the late 60s, early 70s, that kick for urban renewal, what a kick in the pants that was. You guys, we're all old enough to remember when that bank building still had its 1890s look to it, and then they had to modernize it into what it looks like now. took some of the charm out of that building. But then again, on the other hand, it's still standing and it's still viable, and that part's pretty cool too. I wonder if there's any neat things though still hidden inside, you know? Just like the fire hall that got recently restored. My grandfather used to tell me all kinds of neat stories about what it's like in that place. All right, let's move on to Fraser Eels. Do you guys remember?
You want to talk about it? The Eels family commuted to Lake Vermilion in the summertime from Iowa.
Mm.
And they live on a property that was Fraser's. And there have been siblings that have stayed around and are now gone and things like that. But mother, they're all in the same property area and are in the property that grandfather Griggs bought. And if you sit down with these people and if you bring enough Hudson Bay Scotch to the party, I guarantee you sooner or later they'll be part of the flotilla.
Well, I'm glad you told me that story because Jack McKenna once told me a story, and you guys all remember Jack, the legendary meteorologist I got my start under back in the 80s. What a guy, what a guy. He talked to me about coming up to Ely for a party for the sled dog races as the guest of Mayor J.P. Grahawk, and he brought a load of scotch. And he told me, though, everyone in Ely wanted Peachtree brandy, so he went home with a lot of scotch. It's good to know there's somebody up here who will drink scotch. All right, let's go. Merle Bystrom, not a very happy ending to that story. If you're not familiar with it, I'll tell it here in just a little bit. That was one of the researchers, or one of the research topics I was able to find very interesting information about easily. And of course, the last contestant is Ron Hine. Anyone here a veteran of LTV or Erie Mining? And you know Ron, he lived up here in the Tower area after getting a job at LTV, started as a welder, and by the time LTV closed, he had worked himself up to vice president of some kind of relations, so he became a pretty big deal. And he also was in the Army National Guard, and he retired as a brigadier general. In the last couple of years, Ron wrote a book on the history of taconite, Hoyt Lakes, and Erie mining, and I did a history story on that, which you can find online at northernnewsnow.com in the Holding On to History section in case you want to become more familiar with Ron. But as a young man in his 20s living on Lake Vermilion, he felt it was his duty, even though he was an Army Guardsman, to also be a Coast Guard auxiliarist. And again, he's the one who told me it must have been kind of lax back then, that all he had was the shirt. And he wore improper trousers. Oh, we'd catch hell for that now if we did that kind of stuff after 9/11, and things got tightened up pretty good. So Ron was a member as a young man back in the 60s, and he told me a bunch of these stories, and he's got good roots around the area as well. And so, of course, the Coast Guard unit on Lake Vermilion was called Flotilla 28-4. That stands for Division 28, 4th Flotilla. The Coast Guard Auxiliary is organized in local units, regional units, and Coast Guard districts. So Flotilla 4 on Lake Vermilion was part of Division 28, which covered still covers northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and a slice of the Upper Peninsula. And that's all part of now what's called the 9th Coast Guard District Central Region. And boy, you want to talk about gerrymandering. If you look at a map of Coast Guard districts, especially for the Great Lakes, why aren't we Western District? We're Central District because of the crazy gerrymandering lines that they've put out there. The Western District doesn't even seem to be in the West, but that's the way it goes. And then there's the national level. Specifically right now, my role, I'm proud of this, that's the National Staff Badge. I am the National Director of Marketing for the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary. That 99 cents gets me a cup of coffee at Holiday, but because we're unpaid volunteers, but it is a lot of fun. And it's a good feeling to help pitch in and help people. Have you guys seen those commercials that run on TV about the Coast Guard Auxiliary? You haven't? Well, you need to be watching Channel 6 Family of Channels more often because they're running on there. those are part of the duties that I have done as the Director of Marketing for the nation. Before I move on, let's talk about what I found out about these folks here too, to back up what our special guests were talking about. Of course, John Dragavon was the president of the State Bank of Tower for a number of years. You guys remember his wife, Justine Dragavon? All right. Don't you hate when that happens? I love when it goes off in church. My pastor, he's usually got a good one-liner to follow that up. Justine lived to be 102 years old. Wow. Fraser Eels, he died in 1981. He was 92 years old. He was, it says on his obituary page, which you can find online, he was a veteran of World War II and Korea. He must have been in his 50s and 60s for both of those wars, so I'm assuming he was a career military man. You know, maybe started in the 20s and then retired after Korea and died at the age of 92 in 1981, so no spring chicken. Mr. Stevens was a World War I veteran, and the Tower Cemetery records indicate he died in 1979. And the story of Merle Bystrom seems to be a very sad one. I understand from what I can ascertain from online searching, he was probably a DNR conservation officer out of Cook. He died at age 45 in 1962. He was on vacation, a call came in about a nuisance bear on the Cook side of Lake Vermilion. So he and a friend went and took care of that, and then they went for a boat ride on the Cook end. Decided to stop off for a swim. Bystrom jumped in, never came up again. The other guy didn't know how to work the boat. So he must have been there for a while till somebody found him. And that was the story of Mr. Bystrom then. So 3 years after that article was published, trouble came. All right. Well, Mrs. Wells still is a legend among Coast Guard auxiliarists. This is a clipping I made off of the division website for what's now called Division 30. So it got promoted from 28 to 30 over the years. Now we're in Division number 30. And this is a clipping from the Tower News that Phyllis ran in her little history section a couple of years ago. Still surprised Phyllis has passed on. I thought she would live to be 120, but what was she, like 98? She got pretty close. She did pretty good. So this is a story from the early 60s, around 1962, and I think from some of the wording in it, you can tell that Phyllis wrote this. Mrs. George Wells is the first woman Coast Guard Division captain. So trailblazer, becoming the first woman to achieve fairly high rank in the auxiliary. Let's see, if she became division captain, that probably means she was wearing this set of stripes here. Auxiliary ranks are different than active duty. They look similar, but they do mean different things. But once you get to this three-striper level, you got to wear the scrambled eggs on your cap. And she was the first person to achieve that of the female gender. So to read, a recent issue of the Beacon, which is the official publication of the 9th Coast Guard Auxiliary District, carried a feature story on Mrs. George Wells of Lake Vermilion and Duluth. Mrs. Wells was appointed division captain in the 9th Coast Guard District, the first time a woman had been named to that position. And this is where you can tell Phyllis wrote this, because she wrote like this till her last article. Accepting the bows modestly was the charming newly elected head of Northern Division 28, Leslie Wells. Mrs. Wells, who helped organize and was a charter member of Flotilla 28-4 Lake Vermilion, has long been an active boating enthusiast. Mrs. Wells has been an inspector examiner, as you just told us, John, making you guys pitch in on that. I used to make my wife do that. She wanted to join too, but she gave it up after 15 years. She got tired of crawling around bilges, I guess. But she was good at inspecting vessels. Let's see, Mrs. Wells, ever since joining the auxiliary, she has been doing the inspector-examiner role. She has held all the flotilla offices and moved up this year from division training officer after election to fill the vacancy left by the death of Division Captain E.E. Laidlaw last fall. I couldn't find anything on Mr. Laidlaw. Do you guys know anything about him? Yeah, he must have been from more over the Cook area, but that's a good Finnish name, isn't it, Laidlaw?